Ira Chaleff. Welcome to the Bookaholic Podcast.
Thank you, Deirdre.
Yes, so glad to have you here today. Let's go ahead and get started and into it. Ira is the author of To Stop A Tyrant: The Power of Political Followers to Make or Break, and that's BRAKE, a toxic leader. Thank you so much for writing this book, Ira. I was so excited to receive this book. And I was like, yay, yay, yay. Ira's going to give us a step by step to call the United States. And I was just getting so happy about it. And then in our pre call, he calmed me down to say, this is not about the leader that you may be thinking of, but it is about the followers. It is about the followers. And so I will say that Ira is a quintessential thought leader, and he's going to give us a nonpartisan, a word that we that has been left in the back, a nonpartisan diagram for Democrats and Republicans on how to make sure their own leaders do not amass more power than needed to govern in a vibrant and effective democracy. Okay, Ira, you got a lot. We've got a lot to unpack here. And I love how you have, first of all, in your title, to break, not BREAK, but break, to meaning to stop, the toxic leader. And it makes you wonder how do societies get into these areas of emerging tyrants? How do you get into these society these social constructs anyway? So, but first, let's go ahead and talk about why you wanted to write this book.
Right. Well, when people found out I was writing this book, they would say, "Boy, is that timely." And I would say,
Absolutely.
"Yes, it's timely." And
Yes.
unfortunately, it's been timely throughout human history,
Absolutely.
everywhere and at every age.
Yes.
As you know now, Deirdre, I grew up in a multi-generational family.
Yes.
And my maternal grandmother lost her whole family in the Holocaust. And I became aware of this as a child because we lived in New York and it was hot in the summer and we didn't have air conditioning then. And
Mhm.
people would wear short sleeves or sleeveless. And some of them had numbers tattooed on their arms when nobody
Yeah.
had tattoos. So
Right.
as a kid, I would say, "What's that?" And I would say, "Shh, shh." I was told, "Shh, you don't
Right.
talk about that. You be very nice to these people." And when
Mhm.
I found out what happened, it just entered me so deeply. How does that happen?
Yeah.
Why do people follow such destructive leaders? And in one way or another, throughout my life, I began kind of trying to figure that out.
Mhm.
And at some point, I came to Washington, D.C. I got this really interesting little niche in Washington,
Mhm.
which was a nonpartisan nonprofit that worked with members of Congress and their staffs to try to help them run better congressional offices to serve their constituents better. So,
Oh,
lo and behold, I'm facilitating retreats for over 100 members of Congress,
wow.
everywhere from the Hispanic caucus, Black caucus, all the way to conservative Republicans. And I got to see that, first of all, there was not a strong link between how people, what their politics was, and how they treated their staff. Mm. So,
Mhm.
some people I agreed with politically were really hard on their staff, and some people I did not agree with politically were very, very generous managers in their office. So
Mm.
I started to de-link, in a way, polarity in politics with human behavior, and I
Yeah.
began to see how most of the staff were in their 20s. Some, the older ones, the really old ones, were in their 30s or maybe just 40. whereas the
Right.
member of Congress was typically 40, 50, 60 years old. And
Yes.
some of these young people had really figured out how to be trusted and influential with their leader, and some never figured that out. So
No.
I wound up with this kind of like laboratory for looking at how followers become kind of important agents of
Mm.
shared power with political leader. And a lot of my work has been around that ever since.
Right, right. Well, you say in your book about the followers, and hopefully this will tie into what you were just saying about the staff. He said, however destructive tyrants are, they would be impotent without followers, willing or coerced to execute their designs. Now, that was not necessarily what those staffers were doing, but the importance of the ones who figured it out, of how to be the type of follower that had some power and influence with their leaders, don't operate just on their own, is one of your first points, first of all, correct?
Correct. So, first of all, if a leader doesn't have a follower, they're not leading.
Right.
So therefore, in our society, it was kind of like if you were called a follower, it was kind of like dissing you. But that's
Yes.
crazy because there are no leaders without followers. And
Right.
and the reason I think that we got into that mindset was that we thought follower was like a weak personality type. No, no, no.
No.
Follower is a role you choose. You can be a follower of Dr. King. You can be a follower of Jesus. You can be a follower of, your favorite caster.
Right.
And that's not weakness. It's a role. And then at other
Yeah.
times, the same person is a leader.
Right.
So it's consciously choosing or recognizing which role you're in that relationship, and then how do you play that role with strength and integrity, regardless which of the roles you're playing.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I'm going to bring up the circles, I will say, of influence here, the 5 circles of followers here. So let's go through this. And we see here in the purple circle leader. Okay. And
Mhm.
so the circle one are what you term the confidants. Okay. And they also equal the inner circle. And so let's talk about that. In your book, you describe that as family, old friends, mega finance, senior staff, and favorite loyalties who have the ear of the leader. So talk a little bit more about the circle one.
Yeah. So every political leader has confidants. You can't do what you need to do without confidants. You need people who you deeply trust, who you can bounce things off of. Now, if they're serving you well, they will be truth tellers. They will
Mhm.
say, in this case, that is not a good idea. Or in this case, your strength of rousing up the crowd, you did it in a way that violated fundamental human decency. You have to
Mhm.
rouse up the crowd in ways that support fundamental decency. Unfortunately, too often they cease being truth tellers for a variety of reasons. And particularly if the leader starts to abuse power, and if they become complicit in the abuse of power, then they become colluders in the misuse of power. So, in these chapters on confidants, I tease apart what are the kind of traps that you can fall into? What do you need to stay aware of? And remember, only a few of us are confidants of the President of the United States. But guess what?
Right.
Mamdani in New York has very young confidants around him right now, doesn't he?
Mhm.
And
Absolutely.
you see what I mean? And so being very mindful of what this role entails to truly serve the leader and to truly serve the people the leader is serving.
Right, right. Now let me ask this question. We've all heard the old phrase, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. Am I saying that right?
You are.
Okay, so is there a case to where maybe even your enemies are in your inner circle if you want to really watch them?
It's a very interesting question. We kind of saw this in the Trump first administration. Again, I'm not, as you know, I'm intentionally not polarizing because I
Right.
want this book to be able to be read comfortably by everyone. But we saw that where several people were brought in, probably for that reason. That's one of the reasons that people who are not loyalists are brought in. Now, it can be made to work. Abraham Lincoln was kind of famous for a team of rivals, right?
Mm,
But it takes, unfortunately, here's what happens, Deirdre. When someone starts in office, however they are, they don't remain the same way.
mhm,
The pressures of the office, the stresses, the demands, they all start to take a toll and create shifts in kind of the attention span and the how much you'll tolerate in terms of disagreement, etc. And also, especially if you begin to gain successes and get more power, you become less and less willing to listen to your confidants. And
mhm.
that's where it gets dangerous because everybody's got blind spot. I don't care who you are, you've
Right.
got blind spots. And unless you continue to create an environment in which people around you can say, boss, you've got spinach in your teeth, that you're going to make a mess of things. So
Right.
having people, you could have people who are your quote enemies. I prefer to think of them as your adversaries who, if you work with them correctly, they keep you sharper rather than
Mhm.
undermining you.
Right. But I think you would have to be the type of leader who you'd either have to be super cagey to let that person in, or on the flip side, you could be so on your own accord that you wouldn't dare, want to be surrounded by those kind of people. It could work either way.
It can. You're raising a very important point here that I do bring up in the book, which is that leaders and followers don't have a relationship in a vacuum. They have it in a context.
Mhm.
Every context is different. So, for example, in a multicultural political environment, you would be foolish to not invite into your inner circle people from different cultures because otherwise there's no way you could understand
Right.
how they are perceiving what's happening, how they're being affected by it. So it does take a confident person, a mature person to
Yes.
say, yeah, I know I might not be fully comfortable with these people, but guess
Right.
what? I can learn from them. And even from a Machiavellian point of view, I can use them, but it's better than shutting them out and demonizing them.
Absolutely.
Demonizing them is the poison that occurs in political leadership.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, I could say more about that, but let's go on to circle to the elites. You describe the elites as business leaders, media giants, financial market movers, legislative powerhouses, judicial arbiters, cultural tastemakers, and others who can command the attention of the other circles and followers of that leader. So, and now, even though we don't want to politicize this, but we do need to paint the picture. Let's just say for our outlook here in the States, that could be, say, Jeff Bezos or Tim Cook to Donald Trump because it mentions business leaders. And I think they were prominent in being at the inauguration. So you can kind of look maybe to the inauguration to find out some of these people in this description. What do you
Yes,
think?
yes. Now, in all societies, no matter how they are structured, all the way from, really truly as close to a democratic republic as you can get to a really autocratic, there's always a combination of the elites and the populace, and we'll get to the populace later on,
Mhm, mhm.
that um, allow the leader to get into power, keep the leader in power, and remove them from power. Okay.
Right,
I
right,
mean, we have to deal with the world that is, not the world we would wish to be. So
right.
so that's a reality. Now, I take a little bit of a possibly unique slant on elites, and I say that an elite is anyone who themselves commands enough attention, from their segment of the society, that the leader needs to pay attention to them because they
Absolutely.
could hurt or harm them.
Mhm.
So that's why
Absolutely.
these run the gamut,
Mhm,
from
mhm.
Taylor Swift to you know
Right.
the Bishop of Washington D.C. to
Mhm,
whomever, anyone
mhm,
who has a following. and
mhm.
and one day, Deirdre, I hope you're one of the elites.
Oh, wow. I hope so from your mouth, from your lips to God's ears.
Yes. Now the trap for the elites is this: usually society is working pretty well for them,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
And then, so when whoever it is gets into power, and if they start to, be quite authoritarian, the elites, they can see which side their bread is buttered on, and they say, well, you know, we can use this authoritarian leader. We have so much power; they're never going to really control us. We'll kind of quietly control them, and
Right.
that's one of the greatest errors ever. You go look
Mhm,
at Putin, and after the fall of the Soviet Union, and Russia was putting itself back together, and you
mhm.
had all of these billionaires came out of it, and
Yes.
and they can use Putin. He'll kind of protect our, privilege and all of that, until the first one, Gorski, made a little bit of a criticism of Putin. And the
Mhm.
next thing he knew, he was sentenced to jail for 14 years, stripped of all his wealth and his family's wealth. That's the mistake. Elites don't realize that
Right,
they cannot play with the fire of
right.
empowering someone who really has tyrannical tendencies.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Wow, that's awesome. That's really chilling, actually. So, circle three are what we call the bureaucrats, or they're the operational circle. So, these are the professionals and administrator who operate the levers of government. So, that's your cabinet members, that's your undersecretaries, etc.
Let me create a little distinction, Deirdre.
Okay.
Some of the cabinet members really may fall into the elite or even the
Yeah.
confidant circle,
Yeah.
depending who
True.
they are.
True.
Every government, no matter what its form, has a large body of what we call here civil servants. Okay.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
in the United States, we have about 2 million non-military federal civil servants. Huge. And
Mhm.
these, now, bureaucrats have gotten a really bad name in our culture, but in fact, almost everything that you count on the government for, whether it's your social security check, or your food safety, or air traffic regulation, or whatever, it's
Mhm.
bureaucrats who are keeping the engines of government running. So
Mhm. Mm.
no political leader, good, bad, or indifferent, can manage a government without bureaucrats. Now, this gets challenging because in a democratic society, the elected officials get to set the policy, and and that includes, hopefully, Congress as well as the executive.
Yeah.
And then the bureaucrats are bound in a nonpartisan manner to implement those policies. Most of the time, that works fine.
Mm-hmm.
But if you get into a situation where the leader and the political people around him are misusing the power of the bureaucracy, now what does the bureaucrat do? They've got a
Right.
moral obligation that's higher than the assigned role. And so I spent a lot of time with literally thousands of people served in so many different agencies.
Mm-hmm.
And most
Mm-hmm.
of them, yeah, some are slack offs. I get it. It's true.
Right.
Most of them are very serious people who've really learned a lot in their field and are really trying to do their best in challenging environments.
Yeah.
So in these chapters, I take up the different ways that bureaucrats can stay true to
Mm-hmm.
their own values and their commitment to the Constitution while doing their best to survive and and to influence. It is tricky because you see on the political right now, you hear all about the deep state, right?
Yes.
What do they mean about by the deep state?
Please tell them.
Yeah, well, non-elected bureaucrats are actually calling all the shots. Okay, thinking. Now, it actually happens to be true in all bureaucracy, studies the nature of bureaucracy, that bureaucracies do tend to start to accrue a sense of power and entitlement to themselves. And
Mm-hmm.
once in a while, it takes a charismatic leader to come along and shake them up and say, hey, remember, there are constraints. This is your role. So when we see shakeup occurring, it's very painful and it could be done very poorly. It
Mm-hmm.
won't necessarily mean that the final outcome is a negative. It could be that we kind of re-examine what is the appropriate role for our bureaucrats and support them in that and trim any biases that may have accrued. That's what my chapters are about there.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Well, now let's go to our fourth one, which is the activist. And so you describe the activist as highly committed individuals and groups who activate and organize segments of citizenry in support of or against political leaders and their policies. Now, let me mention one example of that, the Black Lives Matter movement, which was so hated, and I couldn't understand why people could not get that and what we meant by that. It was an organization founded by three women, three Black women. And so, it just got completely out of hand. Then people started talking about Antifa, which is not a group. Then people were like, well, the response to Black Lives Matter is back the blue, which equaled out to most Black people that meant shoot all Black people possible that you can. So, there's all that. What do you say to what I just said?
Yeah. So the first thing I'm going to say is something you're probably familiar with, and that is that pain that is not transformed is transferred. We have a long history of pain, particularly along racial divides in this country, in other ways as well. And to the degree we have only partially transformed that pain, it still gets transferred.
Yeah.
And we're still working. I need to keep working and keep acknowledging the trauma, that is our historical legacy here. Now,
Yes.
we have to be careful in doing that, that we don't stigmatize everyone on the other side. You see,
Right.
no matter how hard you try to do that fairly, in a adversarial political system, whatever missteps you make are going to be blown up on both sides. They're going to be blown up and magnified out of proportion. What is really the essence of what is trying to be done there?
Right.
What
Right.
I know I've spoken a little bit generally, but I hope I've spoken maybe somewhat fundamentally towards the Black Lives Movement. Now,
Yes. Yes.
activists in general, so there are activists on both sides. There are activists for the emerging political tyrant and activists against the emerging political tyrant.
Right.
And so those who are working against the emerging tyrant, they're going to use the full toolkit that activists use. And I don't need to tell them what that toolkit is. They know that. What I
Mhm.
do need to say to them is to be very, very mindful to not demonize the people on the other end of the issue as
Mhm.
distinct from the behavior. Okay? You have to stand strong against the behavior that's not acceptable, but you still have to understand that the people who are displaying that behavior, there is trauma in their past as well that has somehow gotten them there. And
Mhm.
you're never going to change their minds except by building relationship.
Mhm.
In my book, I use the example of Derek Black and Matthew Stevenson, where Derek Black was a white supremacist who then went to a liberal arts college, and he was shunned when it was realized who he was, except this one student, Matthew Stevenson, who was a Jew and would have Friday night Sabbath meals,
Mhm.
invited him. And interestingly enough, a lot of Matthew Stevenson's friend said, "Well, if that guy's coming, I'm not coming." But he had the courage to invite the person to the table whose views were diametrically opposite. And
Mhm.
over the next couple of months, Derek Black realized through relationship that what he had been taught was not true. And he did a public apology and became, he and Matthew went around the country demonstrating how change happens. So,
Wow.
yeah, it's a very powerful story. So
Wow.
that's what I'm saying to the people who are against the unacceptable behavior. Now, the people on the other side, and remember, they don't think their behavior is unacceptable. We have to realize that.
Right.
But they think they have chosen a leader who is going to remedy the pain that they have felt in life. Okay, now, okay, you can do that. But remember that that leader is not a Messiah. If
Right.
you make them into a Messiah, then they can do no wrong because a Messiah can do no wrong.
Right.
And at that point, once power is unconstrained by loyal feedback, then it becomes more and more distorted and destructive. So I spend a lot of time in these chapters speaking to these people. You don't want to be betrayed by the people you supported. And this has happened big time on the left.
Mhm.
For example, in Nicaragua, overthrow of the brutal Sandinista regime by the left-wing Sandinistas. And then you get 30, 40 years later, Daniel Ortega, who was one of the great revolutionaries, has become as fully oppressive as the regime they overthrew. And
Wow.
you have to stay very mindful that power tends to distort behavior. And early on, catch it, call it, contain it, or else leave it. Don't keep supporting it.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, before we go to the last example of followers, which is the populists, and that's the largest group just by the sheer definition of the word, let's go to the behaviors. There's three behaviors of followers that you describe, and you did touch on colluder a little earlier. So that conformist follower, it goes about their business, falling in line with whatever dictates emanate from the toxic leader. The colluder follows, actively enables the toxic leader, even amplifying it. And the courageous follower seeks a way to counteract the toxicity, including removing the destructive leader if necessary. Can you give us some examples of where we have seen one of each?
Hmm, that's very interesting. Well, colluder followers, I play it a little bit safe in the book because I want the book to be able to speak to everyone in our highly polarized system. So
Yes.
rather than pick someone from this administration, from the Biden administration or the Trump administration, which I
Hmm.
could do, I look at some of the historic examples of,
Yes.
so, for example, in Tsarist Russia, when they were really trying to reform and become a democracy, and this guy Rasputin comes along, and he just keeps ratcheting up the tendency to be for the ruler to be autocratic and oppressive, and destroys the chance to become a democracy, to evolve into a democracy.
Hmm.
So there are this is definitely something that has to be carefully monitored in the inner circle around the leader, because there are people who are opportunists who will
Yes.
ingratiate themselves, and even when the leader is trying to actually course correct a bit, be a little bit more moderate, they're ginning them up to say, no, 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 you got to be worse. You got to be stronger. And so that's an example of the colluder.
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
conformist, unfortunately, can be the rest of us, where we go, I don't like this, but, I don't mean to be glib about this. Life is not easy.
No.
Whether we're fortunate or unfortunate, life
Right.
is not easy. We
No,
have
it is.
all kinds of personal and family and career issues that need to be dealt with. And, we hope that we have a good government and we don't have to pay a whole lot of attention to them. We can get on with our lives. But unfortunately, there are times in history where that's not true. If we just conform and say, well, I don't like what they're doing, but, I just have to keep sort of my nose down and, work on my own issues, that
Right.
creates a space for the colluders to then have inordinate power. So,
Absolutely.
in a sense, this is a little bit of a wake up call, just like COVID was a little bit of a wake up call that despite all of our medications, we have to be mindful that disease can still fell us. Just
Yes.
so just because we're uh, about to celebrate our 250th anniversary, we have to be mindful that political tyranny can still arise. So
Yes.
we can't be overly comfortable conformists, and instead use these challenges to wake up and put more balance into our lives in terms of tending to the political aspects of them. Now, the courageous follower, this is my earlier works. My earliest book is called The Courageous Follower,
Hmm.
Standing Up to and for Our Leaders. It's done very well. It's used in military organizations and police organizations and church organizations, in government, because it recognizes that leadership's hard, and you really do have to be supportive. You can't get cynical about leaders. We're too prone to be cynical about them. No, they're human beings. They've got their strengths and weaknesses, and we have to try to make them into the best leader that they can be. And I go into that in great depth in The Courageous Follower. At the same time, we have to be willing to take a moral stand if they are abusing their power, and there are different ways to do so. You don't have to just immediately jump in and condemn them. There are ways to correct them. And ultimately, if they are not responsive, to then at least withdraw your support and power. So
Hmm.
that's the courageous follower. And that's what we haven't seen enough around. Let me just be a little bit political, contemporary political now. In the Biden White House, people were not courageous when they saw the infirmities that started to reveal themselves, and instead they protected the president. And I know it's a natural inclination of the inner circle. It's also not courageous following. And it's similarly in the Trump administration now. And we're only beginning to see some people say, look, I still support Trump, but I'm not okay with sending these squads masked into my neighborhoods and scaring the death out of our children. You know,
Right.
so there's being able to hold a balance is what
Mhm.
courageous followership is about.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let me switch it around to this area. So I'm Gen X, and I can't tell you that during my childhood years, that every day that I would go into my elementary school, let's just say, starting off with elementary school, we said the Pledge of Allegiance, and early, very early on, for a Gen X person, you talked about democracy that was ingrained in us. And it was never a question at that time that we could ever lose our democracy, at least for my child's mind and ears and sight. And so, those of us who are Gen X, born in between 1965 to 1980, 85, you know, we are just almost robotic in our democracy. Okay. And so for us to see it teeter away or erode in any manifestation has made us very upset. It's extremely upsetting. And I know it's upsetting to boomers and other generations of people too, but it's extremely upsetting. And it just makes you feel hopeless that how in the world did we get to this area and how do we reel it back? So I'm going to do the last definition of the populace, and that's where all of us fit in. And we are going to, for whatever reason, now I've got to find my populace. Okay, so the outer circle, the populace, the people living in the governmental governed area, the supposed beneficiaries of good government. We can loosely use the more common term citizenry, though non citizens who live under the government's jurisdiction are also included in this circle. So, this populace, which I'm a member of, a lot, millions of people are feeling very hopeless. They feel like they have no agency whatsoever. They're looking at things, and I'm going to choose the contemporary example. They're seeing the east wing of the White House being torn down, and that gave me PTSD just seeing that. I know different presidents make changes for their living surroundings, but to actually take, aim at tearing down the complete status of what the presidency looks like if you were to use a building that would be the White House. So that was scary. There's also other things like you were just mentioning, military in our streets. That's not supposed to be unless there was some type of extreme disaster or, something like that, or an outbreak of some type. There's nothing going on in a lot of cities, and people are, seeing military in their streets. That's not the American way, and so on and so forth. I could go and tell you a lot of horrible examples that I'm seeing right now that just does not represent all that was ingrained in me and millions like me when we were children. So I can look back, I can literally look back and go through the years, and now I'm part of the populace, and I'm wondering how on earth did we get at this stage? There's a lot in there, I know, but
I
the first
know.
question is, how did we get here? From
Yeah,
somebody like me in elementary school where democracy was king, wasn't going anywhere, to now. How did we get there?
yeah, we can have a long conversation about this, and there's many different ways to enter and engage with you in this. First of all, I think I want to go back to the level of trauma that, again, we live in a society where being constantly bombarded with every action that's happening, and in a way that can, as you're calling it PTSD, and in a way that's right, that our nervous system is kept absolutely continually buzzed. And
Yeah.
that's the business model that all of us. It's the business model of the big media. It's the business model of the even the podcasters. So we have to be mindful of that we're being kind of assaulted with this information. Now, what do we do with that? As many people say, well, I stop watching the news, I limit what I'm doing, and that might be necessary for a while for your personal health.
Right.
What I'm trying to do, let me just take myself. So I'm a boomer, I'm not Gen X. So, my parents lived through the incredible horror of fascism in Germany, Italy, and Japan,
Mhm.
nearly winning, and then the Soviet, communism nearly winning,
Yeah.
and the depression, the Great Depression. Look at how
Mm.
existential those threats were. So I step back and I go, okay, every generation has its threats. Let's try to keep that in perspective. And then every generation has to self organize to rise to meet those threats. We're seeing that happening right now. We're
Mhm.
seeing it happened last Tuesday in the elections that we just had. Now, there are no guarantees, but there's an ebb and flow in
Yes.
history. And
Yes.
so, to some degree, stepping back and saying, I don't mean to be casual or supine or even tolerant about this. This too shall pass, but it will pass. Now,
Mhm.
the question is, what is your work? What is my work? What is each person's work to do
Right.
to help that? Now,
Right.
we can't, okay, I have a Jewish background, and there's a saying that has kept me sane. It's from something called the Ethics of the Fathers. And it says, you are not responsible for completing the work of healing the world, but neither does that absolve you from doing your part,
Oh,
you see.
wow.
So each of us has to take stock of what are we called to do. We cannot do everything, but
Right.
each of us can find some point of agency in addition to contributing to the societal good. It is reversing the sense of helplessness. So that is the kind of fundamental thing that I'm recommending. Obviously, in those chapters on the populace, I go into a number of different things that one could do, but I
Yes.
think that's kind of bedrock.
Absolutely. Wow. So let's go into our little last diagram here.
Mm.
And explain this diagram to our viewers on YouTube.
Yeah, it's a little hard to read because the black
It is.
against the purple. So
Right.
so let me try to. Oh, oh, did I lose you?
Nope. I'm
Oh,
here.
you're here,
I'm
but
here.
I just lost the diagram. Hold on a sec.
Okay.
I touched something. I should never be allowed to touch anything. Okay, there we are. So it's very rare that a full-blown tyrant just emerges. There is
Right.
a kind of a pattern to how it happened. So can you see my arrow? Are you seeing that? Or only
I see
on,
the arrow on the at the end of the diagram.
oh, okay, okay. So on the extreme left, it says striving for office. So however
Mhm.
the individual does that in a democratic system, it's through electoral process. In a non-democratic system, it could be through a coup d'etat, but
Mhm.
somehow they get into office. And once they're in office, they start to use the levers of power in that office. Hopefully, they use it sufficiently in service of the populace that they gain popular support for what they're doing, but they got to be politically savvy that they don't frighten the elites so much that the
Right.
elites, sort of organize to undermine them. So this is where political skillfulness comes in. So all of this is quite normal
Mm-hmm.
and useful political behavior. At some point, because there's this famous saying that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now, in other words, power doesn't automatically corrupt, but it tends to corrupt, which is why the founders, put in so many checks and balances. But
Yeah. Which are
but
not working right now,
which
really.
which are they're not working as they're fully intended to right now.
Yeah.
Correct. Now, once abuse of power starts, it and to the degree we can see it, we can't always see it all because it's hidden. But once we start to see it, that's where we need to come alive as a populace. And I'm talking about both those who are not supporting the administration and those who are supporting it. Both should be speaking up and saying, wait, that's not within the value system that we hold here. You then enter this space, which is a window. And at the other end of the window is where power starts to get consolidated.
Mm.
And once, and that takes some time. Frankly, it's been happening very, very quickly under the current Trump administration. But all regimes will try to consolidate power. If
Mm-hmm.
they consolidate more power than they need to, in order to do the role that they're expected to play, we move into the territory of dictatorial rule and tyrannical rule. And I take these apart in the book because they're
Mm-hmm.
somewhat different. But here's the key thing: there's a window, and the window doesn't stay open forever.
Right. There's the
And
window.
and in that window is when there's political space to act.
Mm-hmm.
Because once that window closes and you're over in the dictatorial and tyrannical, you don't have any political space to operate. Now that's where you get into extra political activity, which we don't want to get to. So
No.
so throughout the book, I'm calling attention to what are the signs that we've entered this window, doesn't stay open forever, and what are the different tools each of us can use depending on which circle of followers we're in.
Right. Now, so let's say historical perspective of a society that was already in that dictatorial and tyrannical rule, maybe, you correct me, please, was the French Revolution and the Marie Antoinette and the guillotine. Is that an example of that?
Well, that's very interesting because what you've done is you've got the Marie Antoinette, the Louis, the whatever it was, the
Mhm.
14th. So they were obviously a monarchy, which had
Right.
a certain amount of dictatorial powers. They
Okay.
were not using them sufficiently for the benefit of the populace. So a popular movement arose, which we come to call the French Revolution, to overthrow them.
Right.
Unfortunately, what happened in the French Revolution was other people with tyrannical tendencies took control of the revolution and started to wantonly use the guillotine as an instrument of terror. And it was only when they went so far that then they were overthrown again. The society started to correct itself again, which is
Okay.
one of the things I talk about in the book. That when you have an authoritarian leader who's tending towards dictatorial or tyrannical behavior, it's necessarily the best thing to remove them because it could create chaos like happened in Iraq after
Right.
Saddam Hussein, or
Right.
it can produce an even worse leader like after Lenin died, Stalin emerges.
Right.
So,
Right.
so
Right.
that's why in the book I say, if at all possible, reform what's happening with the leadership, contain its excesses,
Yes.
use the, like one thing about Donald Trump, no one can argue, he's bringing enormous energy to the role. Okay, those around him should be containing the excesses, channeling the energy. You see what I mean? Nor, because we don't know who follows the leader that we don't like. And there's no final outcome. Politics is always an ebb and flow. We win, the tide comes in, the tide comes out, and each generation has to stay alert, inform itself about what went right, inform generations what went wrong, and how can we take the best actions available to us, knowing that they too may be imperfect, but with integrity and courage, we're doing the best we can.
Absolutely. Now, in that diagram that I just took off the screen, we're in the window, correct? The
We're
window.
still in the window, but the window is being pushed. There's no question about it.
Yes, it certainly is. It certainly is. And going back to the hopelessness and the helplessness that some may be feeling, ways that, and again, when I throw out these examples, I want you to either say yes or no and correct me. Ways that we can help ourselves is, of course, by voting, like people did Tuesday, thank goodness, or organizing and helping out on the local, because as they say, all politics is local. So some of the people you may think of as horrible on the federal level, they came from a local perspective, most of them, and have risen to your state government or risen to some of the low levels of the federal government. So voting, doing the King's protest, would those be examples of how we can not be so helpless and
Okay.
hopeless?
Now, yes. So now, if you, and again, your your listeners may think, how can he say this? But if you are in the camp of Americans who are alarmed by the Trump administration, yes, you use all the tools of legitimate and legal protest, no King's rally being one of them, with a caveat that rallies like that generate energy, but don't create change. What creates change is organizing after the rally. You do all the kinds of things, that you've talked about. Now, what about the other half of Americans,
What
right?
about them?
Well,
Okay, we gotta be
okay.
open mind.
Yes, yes. Now, they have felt some kind of like disenfranchisement in the past. They saw
Mhm.
their jobs moving overseas. They lost the ability to support their families. 28% are on food stamps, lack of food security, etc. And so, and again, throughout history, a populist comes along and says, I can fix this, and they look around and they go, well, what's working, what's here now isn't fixing it. So, all right, let me give you a shot at it. Now, what's important for them is pay attention, because where the person you're supporting and put into office is doing things that make sense to achieve the productive goals that you hope for,
Mhm.
keep supporting them. But where they're doing things that do not make sense, don't blindly keep supporting them. Use
Right.
your voice, and in all the different ways you can. You're writing to your legislators, visiting your legislators, going on social media, what have you, to say, you could say, look, I still believe in you, but I do not support this. And I'm asking you to please take this seriously and change it. That's absolutely crucial, you see, because that's how we stay together as a country. We don't
Yes.
fracture, and we all kind of move this kind of clunky thing called democratic government back in the direction that we hope it should be going in.
Right, right, absolutely. And last but not least, Thanksgiving is coming up. We are gathering with a variety of family and friends for our traditional American meal. And I've heard through the years, now it's like families have had to just either put out some type of statement. We're not going to talk about politics. We're not going to talk about this or that. How can we have a great Thanksgiving with diverse thoughts amongst family and friends? Just give us a few examples of how we can try to understand each other better based on your book.
Okay, first of all, if your family agrees to set the rule of no politics, I'm okay with that. Drop deeper into love and gratitude.
Yes,
That's the foundation. Now,
right.
if your family has sufficient emotional capacity to enter into the conversation, what I would suggest is, first of all, in the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving, instead of just watching the news wherever you get your news from, watch some of the news where they get their news from, the people who disagree with you. Now,
Oh,
it's going to be hard to do. You're going to sit there in front of the television kind of yelling at it, but you need to understand what they are hearing and
yeah,
how they're forming their views based on what they're being told and the analysis they're being given.
yeah.
I in the book, I'm really strong on this, that if we were living in a dictatorship, we would only get our news from one source. Why
Yeah,
do we do that to ourselves?
right. Oh, good point.
Yeah. So, and
Good
that's
point.
it's not emotionally easy. I'm warning you, but it's necessary if you're going to then be able to meet people with a 180-degree divergent view with some understanding of how did they get there, where they're coming from, and how might there be some space in which we can meet constructively together.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, Ira, we certainly have taken a deep dive into your book, To Stop a Tyrant: The Power of Political Followers and to Make or Break. And I emphasize break as in stopping, BRAKE, a toxic leader.
Yes, and
Ira,
Deirdre, it is also available in audiobook now, and I know for
ooh,
many people they prefer that. I've shortened the subtitle in the audiobook. It's simply The Power of Political Followers, the subtitle.
okay, got you, got you. Well, Ira Chaleff, thank you so much for bringing your expertise and your view to the Bookaholic podcast. We certainly do need this and to be explained to these things. I thank you for this clarity.
Thank you, Deirdre.
And if you're interested in purchasing To Stop a Tyrant, all you have to do is just connect with the video description box on YouTube and with the podcast show notes. Thanks for listening.